welcome to the Daily Show. I'm your host, John Carter. And tonight, Australia's fuel crisis. Are you to blame for filling up your car? Or perhaps it is the media's fault for reporting on the Iranian war? Well, one thing is for sure, if you listen to the Labor government, it certainly isn't their fault.
Petrol pinch is closing in on Sydney siders. The city's first petrol stations have run out of fuel. All bowsers were dry at Yugo, Carlingford this morning, and at Borkham Hills there was no E10. They're among 38 petrol stations in New South Wales that have reported being out of fuel. Deliveries later today meant some were back up and running, a relief for motorists, but many remain fearful this is just a glimpse of worse to come.
The absurdly small fuel reserve Australia has, just over a month, is entirely in Labor's control. Now, we have no energy security in this country, and that is by design. We have aggressively transitioned the economy away from fossil fuels. And now, if there is a global conflict that lasts a few weeks, strangling global supplies, blink, and our reserves will dry up. The Labor government's worst performer in cabinet, by far, Chris Bowen, doesn't seem to think that this is a problem, though. This week, he did the press circuit and he blamed you for his mismanagement.
Whether it be petrol, diesel or anything else, is going to run short in some areas if you get that big spike in usage. Not actually people using petrol, but people buying petrol. And that's why, while I understand people watch the news and see ships being blown up in the Strait of Hormuz and worry about it, let's deal with the facts. Others are scaremongering, others are playing.
Good day, Australia. Imagine you hire a lifeguard. His entire philosophy is that swimming is dangerous, water is the enemy, and one day humanity will evolve past needing to go near the ocean. Then a tsunami hits, and you are surprised when he is not prepared. That, in a single analogy, is the story of Chris Bowen, Australia's Energy Minister, who has spent 3 years at war with the very thing his job title says he is responsible for managing. And right now, Australians are paying for it at the bowser. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Australian Mind. Hit subscribe and tap that notification bell, because this channel covers the stories that deserve far more scrutiny than they are getting. Now, let us be precise about what has actually happened, because the government would very much prefer you stay confused. The Middle East conflict that disrupted global oil supply was the trigger, but triggers only cause damage when the conditions are already fragile. And Australia's conditions were fragile long before a single missile was fired near the Strait of Hormuz. Here is the number that should be on the front page of every newspaper in this country. Just over 20 years ago, Australia had 8 oil refineries that met most of the country's demand for refined fuel. 8. Today, 2. They were shut down one by one, deemed economically unviable, while successive governments, Labour and coalition alike, decided that importing cheap refined fuel from Asia was perfectly fine. That is not an energy strategy. That is a government outsourcing the nation's survival to foreign supply chains and hoping for the best. But here's where Chris Bowen enters the picture in spectacular fashion. Because while previous governments let those refineries quietly die, Bowen arrived in office in 2022 with a singular, almost religious conviction. Fossil fuels are the past, renewables are the future, and anyone who disagrees is either a climate denier or a tool of the coal lobby. He declared this loudly, repeatedly, at press clubs, at climate summits, at every media opportunity available to a man who genuinely seems to enjoy the sound of his own certainty. Bowen told Australians that the way to move away from fossil fuel dependence is to build renewable energy, pointing to the grid hitting 51% renewable supply as proof the transition is working. Beautiful, inspiring, completely irrelevant when your car needs petrol and the bowser is dry. Because here's the thing about renewables that Chris Bowen's elegant speeches consistently gloss over. You cannot put solar panels in a truck and drive brain to regional Queensland. You cannot power a harvester on wind energy. You cannot fuel the fishing fleet off Broome with good intentions and a battery storage rebate. Liquid fuel is not a relic of the past. It is the circulatory system of a continent-sized nation, and an energy minister who treats it as an embarrassing afterthought has left Australia fundamentally exposed. Australia is not even compliant with its International Energy Agency obligation to hold 90 days' worth of net imports in reserve. 90 days, a treaty obligation, not a suggestion, not a target, a signed commitment that Australia has quietly, consistently failed to meet. And this government sailed into a global supply crisis already behind the line. When the crisis hit, Bowen's response was to release up to 20% of Australia's minimum stockholding obligations for petrol and diesel, 762 million litres, to address localised shortages in regional areas. That sounds decisive until you understand what it actually means. He was releasing emergency reserves to plug holes that his own policy neglect helped create. It is the equivalent of a doctor prescribing blood transfusions to a patient whose anemia they refused to treat for 3 years. And then, because this story could not get more tone-deaf, Bowen held a doorstep press conference at Climate Week in Sydney, while regional Australians were queuing at petrol stations and farmers were sounding alarms about diesel for harvest equipment. Climate Week, while the fuel crisis was live. A man so ideologically committed to the energy transition that he will hold a green energy press conference during an actual energy emergency. Now, to be fair, and the Australian mind is always fair, Bowen is not solely responsible for the refinery closures. Those decisions stretch back decades, but he is responsible for 3 years of energy policy that treated liquid fuel security as yesterday's problem, for a renewables obsession that left no room for honest conversations about transition risk, and for presiding over a department that was caught genuinely flat-footed when the global supply chain buckled. The sun and the wind, as Bowen loves to remind us, cannot be interrupted by a Middle East war. True, they also cannot refuel a semi-trailer on the Stuart Highway. And until that gap is honestly addressed, Australia remains exactly as vulnerable as it is today. Thanks so much for watching. It genuinely means the world.